This playlist collects together and organizes the individual component modules, which together will comprise our third lecture in the course. This lecture focuses on the early genesis of our notions of the mind, the synthesis of this concept in the form of the synthesis of a concept of the soul in the early works of the presocratic philosophers. Taking our cue from the discussion in that second module of the second lecture, we'll see that this synthesis of the notion of the mind in the receptacle of the soul really draws from three native dispositions we have to distinguish between different kinds of entities. It draws from that native disposition to distinguish between living and non-living entities, draws from that native disposition to distinguish between animate and inanimate entities, and finally it draws from that native disposition to distinguish between mental and non-mental entities. We'll see that these properties that are generated on the basis of these native dispositions to distinguish between these kinds of entities get accreted into this common receptacle, the soul. The overall story arc for this lecture goes as follows. We'll begin the lecture by introducing terminology to talk about ontological frameworks generally. I'll start by distinguishing between the traditional way that philosophers talk about positions in the philosophy of mind, the physicalist versus the idealist versus the dualist. I'll explain those positions as they're normally named and discussed, and then I'll modify the framework of that set of categories for the purposes of this course, for discussing ontological frameworks generally. Then we'll turn our attention to discussing a little of the prehistory of the presocratics. We'll put this period into a little wider historical perspective so we get a sort of sense of where it fits in early civilization and in relationship to the golden era of Greece, the Renaissance, and so on. We'll discuss the three theses that I used to organize this narrative, and then we'll discuss the specifics of various pre-Socratic philosophers and their ruminations on the soul, ending this lecture by drawing some morals about the nature of the soul as it emerges towards the end of the pre-Socratic period. In the next lecture module then, we'll pick up that first component. We'll start talking about ontological frameworks, the standardized versions, and the way I want to discuss ontological frameworks in this course.